The divorce papers were still crisp when I saw Rachel's Instagram post that Thursday evening at 7:42 p.m. She stood on a rooftop bar in downtown Phoenix, champagne flute raised, surrounded by faces I didn't recognize, with the caption reading Liberation Day, finally breathing again after 5 years in a cage. My coffee went cold as I scrolled through the congratulations flooding her comments, each heart emoji feeling like a small cut against everything I thought we'd been. I sat in my new apartment in Tempe, boxes still stacked against walls that smelled like fresh paint, wondering how our marriage had become her prison story when I was the one who'd spent years trying to decode her mood swings and mysterious expenses. The notification count kept climbing on her post while I set my phone face down and listened to the ceiling fan wobble slightly, a sound that would have driven Rachel crazy, but now felt oddly comforting in its imperfection. 7 days passed with me establishing routines in my new space, organizing kitchen drawers the way I wanted, playing music she'd always called depressing, and trying not to check her social media every hour like picking at a wound. Then came the knock at 9:15 p.m. the following Thursday, 3 quick taps that made me mute the documentary I wasn't really watching. Through the peephole, I saw Maya Thornton, Rachel's younger sister, holding her arms crossed tight against her body despite the warm desert evening, mascara smudged beneath her left eye like she'd tried to fix it in her car but given up. Maya and I had always gone along at family gatherings, sharing eye contact when Rachel would launch into another story about her latest shopping find or complain about my suggestion to try cooking at home more often, and seeing her now felt like spotting a familiar landmark in a foreign city. When I opened the door, she said my name, Marcus, just once, testing if I was real or if she'd imagined this whole visit on the drive over. I stepped aside and she entered, looking around my bare walls and minimal furniture with something between relief and sadness, then sat on my second-hand couch like she might shatter if she moved too quickly. She asked if I'd seen Rachel's celebration posts, plural, because apparently the rooftop bar was just the beginning of a week-long victory tour that included a spa retreat in Scottsdale and enough shopping bags to fill her new luxury apartment near Camelback Mountain. I nodded and waited because Maya's hands were shaking as she pulled a tissue from her purse, and I'd learned during my marriage that sometimes the most important thing was to let silence do its work. She finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper, telling me Rachel wasn't sleeping, hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks, and was running through money like she was being chased by something only she could see. The Rachel I'd married kept receipts organized by date in a filing system she'd perfected in college, measured her coffee creamer with an actual tablespoon, and once spent 3 hours comparing auto insurance quotes to save $12 monthly. But Maya painted a different picture, one where Rachel had blown through her divorce settlement of $73,000 in less than 10 days, signed a lease on a $4,200 monthly apartment she couldn't sustain, and bought a Mercedes she'd already missed the first payment on. I felt my chest tight as Maya explained how Rachel had been hiding credit card debt throughout our marriage, $31,000 spread across 5 cards she'd opened using her maiden name, and had delivered to their parents' house in Chandler. She'd been juggling minimum payments and balance transfers like a circus act, all while accusing me of being controlling whenever I'd suggest we review our budget together or question why she needed another handbag when she had a closet full. Maya had discovered this 3 years ago when she'd seen a past due notice at their parents' house, confronted Rachel, then agreed to keep the secret after Rachel sobbed and promised she'd handle it herself. The memory of our last counseling session hit me differently now, Rachel sitting with perfect posture, telling the therapist I monitored her spending like a warden, that I sucked the spontaneity from life with my spreadsheets and savings goals, while her thumb nervously rubbed the edge of her phone case in that way I now recognized as her tell. Maya continued, explaining how Rachel had been setting up conflicts deliberately, picking fights about my meal planning or how I always wanted to wait for sales, then using my frustrated responses as evidence to her friends that I was impossible to live with. Each time I'd tried to discuss our finances rationally, Rachel would escalate until I'd retreat, and she'd mark it as another victory in her campaign to paint me as the villain in our story. The truth was spreading across my living room floor like spilled wine, staining everything I thought I understood about why my marriage ended. Maya told me about the shopping binges Rachel hid by having packages delivered to her office, the cash advances she'd taken for girls' trips I thought were modestly budgeted, the investment app where she'd lost $8,000 trying to day trade cryptocurrency based on TikTok tips. By the time Maya left at 11:30, I stood at my window watching her taillights disappear, feeling like I'd been handed a translation guide for a language I'd been failing to understand for 5 years. 3 days later, my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. with Maya crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Rachel had been arrested the night before at a high-end boutique in Fashion Square for attempting to use a declined credit card, then causing a scene that required mall security and eventually Scottsdale police. She'd spent the night in holding, and their father Robert had just bailaid her out, driving her home in silence while she ranted about identity theft and insisted someone had hacked her accounts, probably me, as revenge for the divorce. I met Maya at a coffee shop on Mill Avenue that afternoon where she showed me printed bank statements she'd convinced Rachel to let her review, supposedly to help find the hackers. The numbers were staggering because Rachel had taken cash advances totaling $45,000, invested $15,000 in a multi-level marketing scheme selling wellness supplements, and spent the rest on furniture, clothes, jewelry, and bottle service at clubs where she'd pick up tabs for strangers to feel powerful. Maya's voice broke when she explained how Rachel hadn't slept in 72 hours before the arrest, had been talking faster and faster about business ideas that made no sense, and kept saying she was finally free to be her authentic self. The father, Robert, wanted to intervene but didn't know how to help someone who insisted everyone else was the problem, and their mother, Patricia, just cried and asked where her careful, organized daughter had gone that evening. I sat with the information like holding a live wire, knowing Rachel's spending spree wasn't just recklessness but something deeper and more frightening. The woman who'd once spent a weekend researching the best vacuum cleaner was now hemorrhaging money faster than she'd ever earned it, and the celebration posts kept coming like dispatches from someone else's life. She'd posted a photo from a helicopter tour she couldn't afford, champagne in hand, captioned with something about eagles not asking permission to soar, and I wondered if mania always looked like freedom from the inside. 5 days after the arrest, things escalated beyond what any of us expected. Rachel had convinced a luxury car dealership to let her test drive a $90,000 Tesla, then refused to return it, driving to Vegas at 2 a.m. with a group of people she'd met at a club that night. Maya called me from her car, following the GPS tracker on Rachel's phone, begging me to help because their parents were too shocked to act and she didn't know what else to do. I drove through the night to meet them in Vegas, finding Rachel at the Cosmopolitan at 8 a.m., still in the same clothes, trying to put the room on a maxed-out credit card while her new friends had already scattered. She saw me in the lobby and her face went through expressions like a slot machine spinning, landing on rage, then confusion, then something almost like relief before cycling back to anger. She accused me of stalking her, of being unable to let go, of trying to control her even after the divorce, while the desk manager quietly called security and Maya tried to calm her down. When security arrived, Rachel broke down completely, sobbing that everyone was against her, that she just wanted to live her life, that the money was hers to spend how she wanted. The hotel agreed not to press charges if we got her help immediately, and Robert drove up with Patricia to take her to a psychiatric facility that specialized in bipolar disorder, which the intake counselor said seemed likely given her symptoms. I followed their car for the first hour, then turned back toward Phoenix when Maya texted that Rachel had agreed to admission, exhausted and finally admitting she couldn't stop her thoughts from racing. The next 3 weeks passed in careful updates from Maya while Rachel went through evaluation and medication trials. The diagnosis was bipolar I, with the divorce apparently triggering a manic episode that had been building for years, hidden under what we'd all thought was just Rachel being difficult or impulsive. Her psychiatrist explained that she'd probably been hypomanic throughout our marriage, self-medicating with shopping and creating chaos when the pressure built too high, then crashing into periods where she'd sleep 12 hours and blame me for her unhappiness. The debt was worse than even Maya had known, totaling $127,000 across credit cards, personal loans, and cash advances, not including the money she'd blown through from the divorce settlement. Rachel started bankruptcy proceedings from the facility, her lawyer visiting with paperwork she signed with a hand that shook from medication side effects, finally understanding that her liberation fantasy had been mania dressed up as empowerment. I visited once at Maya's request, finding Rachel in the common room doing a jigsaw puzzle, moving pieces slowly like she was relearning how her hands worked. She looked up when I sat down, and for the first time in years, her eyes seemed actually present instead of scanning for the next thing to want or worry about. She apologized, not dramatically or desperately, but quietly, saying she understood if I couldn't forgive her but wanted me to know that she could finally see how sick she'd been. She talked about the lies she'd told herself and everyone else, how spending felt like proving she was worth something, how picking fights with me gave her an excuse to avoid looking at her own problems. She said the mania made her feel invincible, like she'd finally broken free from all the rules and restrictions, not realizing those rules were what kept her tethered to reality. I told her I forgave her but couldn't forget the damage, and she nodded like she'd expected nothing less. We sat quietly finishing the puzzle, finding pieces of sky that all looked identical until you paid attention to the subtle differences in their blue. When visiting hours ended, I left knowing this was the real conclusion to our marriage, not the papers or the rooftop celebration, but this quiet acknowledgement of what had actually happened between us. Maya drove me home, thanking me for coming, for not being cruel when I had every right to be. She said their parents were attending family therapy to understand how they'd missed the signs, how Rachel's perfectionism in high school and college might have been early symptoms they'd praised instead of questioned. She talked about Rachel's teenage years, the weeks where she'd redecorate her room 3 times or study for 20 hours straight, followed by crashes where she'd barely leave bed, patterns they'd attributed to teenage moodiness or academic pressure. The shopping addiction started in college with credit cards campus recruiters handed out like candy, and she'd hidden the bills until graduation when she'd broken down and confessed to $15,000 in debt that their parents paid off, thinking it was a one-time mistake of youth. Now it all looked different through the lens of diagnosis, a story of illness masked as personality traits, enabled by everyone who found it easier to accommodate than confront. 6 months later, I received a letter from Rachel, her handwriting smaller and more careful than I remembered. She was living in a halfway house in Mesa, working part-time at a plant nursery, attending therapy 3 times weekly and mood disorder support groups where she was learning to recognize her triggers. She wrote about the humility of bankruptcy court, the judge who'd seen too many cases like hers, the trustee who'd liquidated her luxury purchases for pennies on the dollar. She didn't ask for anything, just wanted me to know she was stable, medicated, and slowly rebuilding a life that didn't require an audience or applause. She mentioned she deleted social media, finding the constant performance exhausting now that her brain wasn't racing toward the next high. She was learning to find satisfaction in small things like keeping her succulent collection alive or finishing a shift without feeling the urge to spend. I wrote back briefly, wishing her continued stability and thanking her for the update. I'd started seeing someone new, Jennifer, who worked as a financial counselor and understood why I needed complete transparency about money. She didn't mind my spreadsheets or my need to discuss major purchases, seeing them as responsible rather than controlling. We moved slowly, both carrying damage from previous relationships, but finding comfort in honest conversations about boundaries and expectations. Maya still texts occasionally with updates about Rachel's progress, how she stayed stable for 8 months now, attends every appointment, takes her medication despite the weight gain she hates. Rachel's working full-time now at the nursery, living with 2 roommates in a modest apartment in Gilbert, paying her bankruptcy trustee monthly and slowly rebuilding credit. Their parents have found their own support group for families of people with bipolar, learning how to support without enabling, how to recognize warning signs without becoming surveillance. The rooftop celebration photo still exists somewhere on the internet, Rachel in her designer dress with champagne raised high, surrounded by people celebrating her freedom. Sometimes I think about that version of her, manic and magical, spending money like it was infinite, believing she'd finally escape the cage of our marriage. Now I understand the cage was never me or our life together, but the illness she'd been fighting without knowing it was there. The real prison was her own mind cycling between highs that felt like heaven and lows that felt like death, while everyone around her, including me, tried to make sense of behaviors that would never follow logical patterns. The cruelest thing Rachel did wasn't the financial deception or the character assassination or even the public celebration of our divorce. It was letting me believe for 5 years that I was somehow failing as a husband when no amount of patience or budgeting or couples counseling could have fixed what was actually wrong. But I can't entirely blame her for hiding an illness she didn't know she had, for trying to manage symptoms she thought were personality flaws, for creating narratives that made her feel less broken. The tragedy wasn't that our marriage ended, but that it took a complete breakdown for anyone to recognize what had been happening all along. Now, 2 years after that Thursday evening when I first saw her liberation post, I live in a different apartment in Chandler with Jennifer, where we keep separate accounts but transparent records, where big decisions require discussion and small pleasures don't require permission. We cook dinner together most nights, something Rachel always found boring, and find satisfaction in the rhythm of ordinary life. There's no drama, no mysterious charges, no walking on eggshells waiting for the next conflict. Jennifer knows my history and I know hers, a marriage to an alcoholic who hid bottles like Rachel hid credit cards, and we've built something careful but solid on the foundation of mutual damage and healing. Rachel sent a final letter 6 months ago saying she'd met someone in her support group, another person learning to manage bipolar, someone who understood the daily work of staying level. She wanted me to know she wasn't using him to escape or avoid, but genuinely trying to build something healthy with someone who understood the illness from inside. She thanked me for the years I tried to help without knowing what I was fighting, apologized again for the damage, and said she hoped I'd found the peace our marriage never had. I didn't respond this time, feeling the conversation had reached its natural end. The divorce papers sit in a filing cabinet now, no longer symbols of failure but documents marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of necessary change. Sometimes I remember the good years before things got bad, when Rachel's energy felt exciting rather than exhausting, when her shopping was occasional treats rather than compulsive spending, when we'd laugh at comedy shows and plan modest vacations we could afford. Those memories feel like photographs from someone else's life now, colored by everything I learned after. Maya got married last spring and both Rachel and I attended, seated at different tables but nodding politely when we passed. Rachel looked healthy, maybe heavier from medication but steady in a way she'd never been during our marriage, talking quietly with relatives who'd learned to forgive if not forget. I sat with Jennifer, introducing her to family who'd watched my marriage explode, everyone careful not to mention the past while navigating around it like furniture in a dark room. During the father-daughter dance, I saw Rachel crying quietly at her table, maybe mourning her own wedding or the chaos she'd caused, or simply feeling the weight of medication that kept her stable but dampened everything else too. Maya hugged her sister later, and I watched them hold each other like survivors of the same storm, which in a way they were. The reception ended without drama, everyone dispersing into the Phoenix night with relief that we'd all made it through intact. Life continues now without the wild swings that defined those final years with Rachel. I wake up, go to work at an engineering firm, come home to Jennifer, and live a life that would have bored Rachel to tears but feels like peace to me. Sometimes a charge on our joint account for groceries or gas triggers a moment of panic muscle memory from years of financial surprises, but it passes when I remember this relationship operates on different rules. We save money, plan purchases, discuss dreams that fit within our means, and find joy in stability rather than spite it. Occasionally I'll see something that reminds me of Rachel, a woman at Target loading her cart with things she probably doesn't need, someone at a restaurant insisting on paying for everyone's meal with a credit card they fumble to find, and I feel a mix of recognition and relief that it's no longer my problem to solve. The truth is I loved Rachel, maybe still loved the person she was in her calm moments, but I couldn't have saved her from an illness neither of us knew existed. The divorce wasn't a failure but a necessary ending to a situation that was destroying us both in different ways. She needed treatment I couldn't provide, and I needed honesty she couldn't give, and those two truths couldn't coexist in a marriage. Her sisters knocked that night 7 days after the celebration saved us both by starting the avalanche of truth that buried our false narratives. Rachel got diagnosis and treatment, I got answers and closure, and Maya got her sister back from the edge of complete destruction. The champagne toast on that rooftop was actually a goodbye to the person Rachel had been trying to be, the one who could handle everything alone, who didn't need medication or therapy or limits, who could spend her way to happiness. The real celebration came later, quieter and harder one, in milestone chips from her spending addiction group, in months of mood stability marked on a calendar, in the ordinary achievement of keeping a job and paying rent without drama. I think about that sometimes when I see social media posts celebrating divorce like victory. Wondering how many are running from themselves rather than their spouses, how many will crash after the high wears off, how many are actually symptoms dressed up as self-empowerment. But mostly I don't think about it at all anymore, living instead in the present with someone who shares my values about money and honesty, building something sustainable rather than exciting, choosing peace over passion every single time. If this story meant something to you, you're going to love what's coming next. Click that video right there for another story about someone who chose consequences over silence. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. I post new stories every week. Hit that bell so you never miss one. I'll see you in the next one.